Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 329, for the 29th of June 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene
Salutations.
and Lane Haygood.
Hello.
I should say Lane Haygood Esquire, shouldn't I? All
Oh
right.
no, no, no,
No,
no, no.
no. Okay, well, I won't
That is
say
the
Lane
height.
Haygood Esquire then.
It is considered the height of pretension among lawyers to use Esquire,
The
and
height of
you are
pretension.
you are
Have you
looked
not
down
listened
upon.
to our podcast? All right. Well, we do we do have some comments from our listeners today before we get to The Witch in the Wood or The Queen of Air and Darkness, whichever title you prefer. We have, and we'll do these every 2 weeks because if you're a patron on our Discord, then you'll know that we record 2 episodes at a time to better fit our schedules. And you can watch them, by the way, if you're a Discord member, which you have to do by being a Patreon subscriber. So head over to our website, criticalreadings.com, and click that Become a Patron button at the top of the page. And you'll get access to our Discord for early access to the podcast. You can even watch them live or listen to them live, and you can chat with all of our other subscribers. We have some really fine discussions there about translations and the best versions of concerti and things of that sort. But anyway, this is a comment from Isabel, and she has a very good question. She asked, I'm listening to the book on audio, and several chapters that you were covering were swapped out with completely different stories. The ants chapter became a snake. The geese chapter is Wart paying a visit to the goddess Artemis. Do you know anything about the history of the publication and why White would have changed these stories in what I presume is the later edition my audiobook is following? Well, that's a really good question, Isabel, and you've got it. I mean, you're right, there is a different edition, but the version your audiobook has, which is sort of the standard unabridged edition, is actually the older edition. That's because the audiobook uses the original text of the 4 books. It's not really The Once and Future King. It's The Sword and the Stone, The Witch in the Wood, The Ill-Made Knight, and The Candle in the Wind. It's the 4 separate books, and it's just kind of collected them together into an audiobook. However, The Once
And
and Future King, which came out later, it's actually a revised version of the books that are then put together into the tetralogy. And the dates for these are useful to know. The first edition was in 1938, and that's the standalone work. That was just its individual volumes. They were all published individually. And it includes the snake, and it doesn't include the geese, and it doesn't include the ants. And instead, it's got Wart going off with Archimedes, and Archimedes takes him to the temple of Athene, and Wart gets to hear the dream of the trees. And what this
what
is sort of. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the audiobook has, well, the audiobook that is on Audible has both the snake and the ants, both the geese and the visit
Oh my
to Athene.
goodness. Mine doesn't. So
Interesting.
that's very peculiar. So she's listening to the one I've got, which doesn't have the ants and the geese. It's got the snake and the dream. But apparently the Audible book, they've crammed the 2 versions together. So that's very interesting because that was never published as a print book. So briefly, in that 1938 edition, the ants and geese hadn't been written yet. They were actually written for the 5th book. There was going to be a 5th book called the Book of Merlyn, which takes place at the end of Arthur's life. Arthur's a really old man, and Merlin turns up again, and he gets to go on um, a few more lessons, and he goes to meet the ants and the geese, and there are some other lessons as well. And then he goes off to die at the hands of his son Mordred. But White realized that book was never going to be published, and so he took some of the material from it. He took the ants and the geese, and he put them in The Sword and the Stone, and he removed some things that several decades on he felt somewhat uncomfortable with. He didn't like the Athene sequence, and he didn't like the snake sequence, and he certainly didn't like the cannibals. So he took those all out. He thought they were inappropriate, and he replaced them with some of the material from the Book of Merlin. Now later on, there was a U.S. edition called The Sword and the Stone as well. There was this is when he removed the cannibals for the first time, the anthropophagy, and he put in the chapters about griffins and wyverns instead. And that's the version with the anthropophagy removed that is in the audiobook that you buy on CD and that you listen to on platforms that aren't Audible, apparently. Then, 20 years later, after the 1938 edition, came the Once and Future King, the tetralogy. And it basically used the revised version of the American version of the Sword and the Stone, but it removes the snake and the geese, or the snake and the Athene, and that's when he put in the ants and the geese in the tetralogy. Now, the other books have very minor edits, but it's the Sword and the Stone that really got the bulk of these, because when White initially wrote it, he wasn't thinking of writing a tetralogy, and he certainly hadn't written a fifth book that wasn't going to be used. So that's why these different editions exist. And this was posted on our website, and I also posted a link there that has a timeline. There's a website that has a timeline of this, and it has a breakdown of all the differences between all the books. So if you're interested in delving into the minutiae of the different editions, there's a website for that. So thank you, Isabel, for that fine question.
Just to clarify, the audiobook that I have listened to is from Naxos, Complete Classics Unabridged, and it's read by Neville Jason.
A man with two first names.
Yes.
All right. Well, Mao, who is a subscriber, says, apologies because this is a long one. Now, Mao does not particularly like White's take on the Gales, and this is going to be very important this week. So here we are. Or is it Mao who doesn't like it? No, maybe I've got that wrong. Oh, it is. No, I've got it right. Okay. Mao writes, in relation to the Little Englandisms covered in relation to White, when I read Lord of the Rings, I didn't mind the Little Englandisms because I found the Shire funny, and Tolkien is a better writer than White. Additionally, the Shire is more clearly a romanticization that is out of place in Middle-earth. It is incongruous within Middle-earth, and that incongruity eventually pays the piper in some form, with the scouring of the Shire. It is not good that it happens, but there is an awareness that the Shire's peace is like an island in an ocean of danger, rather than something that is just so and totally natural. Of course, Tolkien's Shire manages to defeat the forces trying to change it, quite unlike real history. While there also does seem to be a natural essence to the hobbits, their humility, but it does not annoy me like the sudden replication of the British class system with White's lauding of the geese and the odd portrayal of the other coastal birds, like they're out of some Dickensian or Mary Poppins-esque production. I think we can be quite clear which aquatic bird White would have liked to be, not the ones the text, verbatim in my edition, describes as, quote, cheerful and cocknified and teasing one another, innumerable crowd of fishwives, end quote. Hobbits feel like far more well-rounded people as opposed to the mere tools for the wart's lesson. As for Moorcock's criticism of Tolkien, I agree with Lane that Moorcock's barrels would be better pointed at White. Maybe White is more honest than Tolkien about his beliefs, but frankly Tolkien is a better writer, and I don't think the main thrust of Lord of the Rings is about Tolkien's belief in a socio-political system. That's part of the reason I feel Lord of the Rings is about Tolkien's belief... Oh, sorry, I misread. That's part of the reason I feel Lord of the Rings has such universal appeal. It can be adopted and interpreted, and perhaps mangled, by so many different kinds of people. That's the great strength of not writing allegorically or in a didactic manner. Indeed, as I was reading Once and Future King, my mind wandered back to Herman Melville and Gene Wolfe. I was thinking, darn, I never really appreciated the absence of explanation those two authors excelled at, until this moment having to trudge through yet another one of White's diatribes against the accursed Celts' blood-hatred against perfidious Albion. I am sympathetic to the fact that White was living through a crazy time for the world, and likely felt his readership needed a lesson. But it has made the writing suffer, in my opinion, and there are probably much better works grappling with the interwar period. My mind goes to The Magic Mountain and Steppenwolf, actually, but I am ranging far away from the matter at hand. While I am in the mood for critique, really the thing I disliked most reading The Once and Future King is that aforementioned hatred for the Irish/Scots. Frequently the two are conflated in the text, which with White you can't be sure is an understanding that the Scottish originally came from Ireland, or if he is lumping together the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish all together as the old enemy of the English, sometimes called the Old Ones, even as if they've stepped out of Lovecraft's imagination. But the panel will deal with that due time, I imagine. My attempt to understand the text only got stranger after learning more about White's life. He seems to have lived a pretty unhappy and misanthropic life, and I can understand that living through the period he did. It definitely produced a book I think is extremely odd for something hailed as an influential classic. Ultimately, White really would have been happier as a goose, I think. Thank you for the series, the podcast, and all. Good health to the panel, and I look forward to more episodes covering this most peculiar take on Arthuriana. Are there any non-peculiar ones? Perhaps only Mallory, by dint of being the codifier of the corpus. Well, that's a very fine comment, Mao, and it covers a lot of ground. We will absolutely get to the matter of the Gaels and the Picts this week, because, of course, they feature prominently over the next 2 episodes. That is really the basis of the action in The Queen of Air and Darkness. But with regard to the Little Englandisms, I think that's a very good observation, right? There is a sense in which Tolkien's Shire is really out of place. It is an island in an ocean of danger. It does have to pay the piper eventually, right? Its naivete, its innocence makes it a fertile ground for Saruman to turn up. Unlike in the movie, he turns up with Grima, right? And they get to put the Shire to some bad uses. But it does come out all right. And as Mao points out, that's quite unlike the real world where the industrialization happened without any issue. What do we think, gentlemen? Is that what makes Tolkien a little bit more palatable to readers who are averse to a didactic lesson?
I completely share the frustrations that this listener has sent in. White is outrageously chauvinistic, and that comes through especially when he talks about the Scottish or the Irish, when he talks about the Gaels, and he is very much a kind of precursor to the Little Englander movement, which is both sort of nationalistic and sort of pacifistic. It's heavily influenced by nostalgia, and both Tolkien and White are heavily nostalgic for what they think feudalism was. And this is really the foundation for their political observations. It's just that Tolkien only occasionally gives you political observations, whereas White has designed the story for teaching these political points. And his politics is pretty simplistic. As I said, it's founded on nostalgia, basically.
All right. Well, thank you for that. We have one more comment, and this is from our 4th episode on the Once and Future King, and it's from Philip. Philip writes, "What a thrilling conclusion to the first section of the summer read, which I found in turns thought-provoking, entertaining, dare I say comedic, and earnest. It's been an unlooked-for delight to see your faces on the recordings, too, after 5 or more years of listening, really getting to see behind the curtain. It was a joy to learn White was going to be the summer read. Unfortunately, I'm deep in dissertation mode and don't have the brain space to read along week to week, so I hope to come back to it in the future. The parts I've appreciated and found most insightful so far were the discussion around different systems, economic, governmental, class, structures of power and domination, and how they affect the everyday person, the comparison of White and Tolkien's romanticized England and feudalism. The attention to White, writing in part from a psychoanalytical framing, which you can tell is certainly more on the nose in some sections. White's choice to use non-human animals as part of Arthur's education. I feel like this grounds his morality in one that transcends species and necessarily prejudices we expect of lesser men, which is needed in order to create Camelot. And White's efforts to ensure that justice and nonviolence are part of Arthur's education, and the conversation around how violence, and by extension war, is normalized in societies. I'd love to read more scholarship about White's views on this, and I believe there's a larger conversation around the schools of pacifist nonviolent thought, such as offensive versus defensive war, but I'm biased, owing to my own interest in the topic." Well, you are in luck for this week, Philip, because that is the beginning of The Queen of Air and Darkness. He continues, "And, of course, any Tolkien adjacencies we can get our hands on. Imagine being a child in the late 1930s, or don't, it would be horrible, and The Hobbit and The Sword and the Stone come out within a year of each other. And then you can grow up to read the rest of the respective series. As far as I know, Tolkien and White never met, nor had any meaningful correspondence with one another, which is curious to me. but not entirely unexpected given White's peculiarities and Tolkien's presumably busy writing schedule. The man had entire fictional languages to create. On that note, I would be elated to see a once and future episode on Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur. I wish he had finished the poem, but what we have is a delight. The majority of the book which I have is Christopher's notes and commentary on the poem, which I also find insightful and eminently rereadable. I can imagine that Tolkien must have loved the chance to write some proper Arthuriana in alliterative verse. As ever, thank you for the care and thought you put into the show. Each episode is a genuine pleasure, and I'm eager to continue with White as we swelter through the summer. Well, yes, we'd love to do the Fall of Arthur at some point. I have a fine copy of that as well. It's part of that series of posthumous publications that were put together by his son, Christopher Tolkien, and they're very, very good. Indeed, we've read some of those before on the podcast, little bits and pieces. With regard to the things you found most attractive, you are definitely going to like this and the next episode because White's political pacifism becomes very foregrounded at the beginning of The Queen of Air and Darkness, and indeed the creation of a new socio-political system and how do you use people who aren't necessarily on board with pacifism in order to advance a pacifist or at least a nonviolent regime is the occupation of the second part of The Queen of Air and Darkness. And we'll find out in the end, and I'm not really sure what White thought about this, but he's relatively faithful to Arthuriana in this regard. It doesn't ultimately endure. It works for a time. Arthur is able to make Camelot. He is able to found the Round Table. I think that, as we'll see at the very end of the book, and we'll talk about this next week, White ultimately lays the failure of Camelot at the narrative. He doesn't think of it as a socio-political failure. He says, well, it's a tragedy. And because it's a tragedy, Arthur has to die. And what is it really about? It's about sin coming home to roost, White says. Right? It's Arthur sleeps with his sister. He doesn't know she's his sister, but nevertheless, in tragedy, innocence isn't enough. And that's why Camelot has to fall. So for White, it's a matter of narrative and generic necessity. It's a tragedy. Arthur slept with his sister. That's why Camelot falls. I don't know that Mallory and other Arthurian authors necessarily thought of it so cleanly in that regard. And in fact, I think Mallory thought something quite different, although certainly that may have been part of it. Mallory equivocates a lot on whether Arthur even knew Igraine was his sister, and that sort of equivocation and indeed fuzziness and contradiction suggests to me that actually for Mallory it wasn't particularly important, right? So he didn't even bother to get the details of it right. What was important for him, and what he traces from the very beginning of the book, the very first episode, Balin and Balin, to the very end, is the blood feud that begins all the way back at Balin and Balin and can be traced all the way down to the end with the Orkney boys and Arthur. So I think for Mallory it's about political systems and blood feud. What do we think, Lane, Drew? Is the socio-political angle in White not handled perhaps as sophisticated as it might have been?
Well, I would say his political views are very narrow and somewhat simplistic, and yet he is determined that his readers should get the point, and he's very heavy-handed about it. The pacifism we'll discuss in due course when we get to that passage, but there's a lot to say about how confused the analysis there is, and it's not even entirely clear what position he's landing on, except that he's got a lot of moralistic finger-wagging. I would also say, just about the point, imagine living in a time when within the same year or close to the same year, the Hobbit and the Sword and the Stone both come out. And it's interesting to compare the two to each other. They have a number of similarities. The Hobbit is a better novel. All the pieces, as episodic as it is, all the pieces necessarily follow each other. One thing leads to the next. It has a coherent plot. Whereas The Sword and the Stone is just like vignette, vignette, vignette. Right? There's no necessary plot. It just these are things that happen to happen, and we'd skip from one to the other.
Indeed, the Queen of Air and Darkness is rather different from that, right? We actually have two major plot twists, threads, and they go back and forth. Lane, you had something you wanted to add.
No, that's it exactly. I don't think that his politics are developed enough to say that he's handling them well, because I don't think he really introspects his politics. He knows what he doesn't like, and he's going to tell you what he doesn't like. But his sort of solution to it is that once you remove, being warlike or the need for domination, then everything just naturally falls into place. There's nothing of the sense of, well, this is what you have to do to build the proper thing, to build Camelot, as it were. It's Camelot happens once you remove the warlike necessity of the old knights.
Indeed, and in fact, Merlyn leaves that up to Arthur. If we see Merlyn as white, and I don't think we necessarily should, but there's a lot of white in Merlyn. Remember that Merlyn doesn't tell Arthur what to do. He kind of relies on Arthur to figure it out himself through thinking. He decides it's very important. I actually happen to share that belief. It is important for people to come up with their ideas themselves and not have them handed to them. It makes them able to defend them in a way that they can't otherwise do normally. But then what happens? Well, Arthur's solution is more war, actually. And Merlyn goes along with this, and then we have a rather tortured discussion between Merlyn, Kay, and Arthur about what basically, just war theory in an Arthurian framing. And here is another place where I wonder to what degree we can identify this with white, because Merlyn doesn't actually make the most convincing argument. And on several points, he's outfoxed by Kay and Arthur, who give him edge cases, and Merlyn can't resolve them. He basically has to throw his hands up, and he says, well, I didn't say this works all the time. I said it works most of the time, right? But the world is full of edge cases. So a system that, the creation of a political system, especially a rather black and white one like Merlyn's, that doesn't take into account edge cases that can be thought up by two young men, is probably not going to work in the real world, where people are trying to break the system. They're trying to find ways to get around it and ruin it. He
doesn't believe that systems determine or even really condition human consciousness. I mean, he's quite explicit about this. He thinks that it is bad actors within systems that cause problems. It is never a systemic problem, which I think is deeply incorrect. Also, I forgot the point about would they have what would they have thought of each other, mm-hmm. Tolkien and White? They were both very difficult people. So, despite the fact that their politics are broadly the same, I don't think they would have liked each other. I don't think they would have gotten on.
No, well, Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and White was not. So, yeah, that certainly would have been a sticking point.
Well, it wasn't a sticking point for Lewis and Tolkien.
Well, that's true. That's true. Although Tolkien desperately hoped that Lewis would one day convert.
Clive, you've got to come to church.
You've got to.
The right church, damn it.
That's how I feel about Drew. I'm just constantly, one day he's going to turn up at Mass. All right. Well, thank you for your comments. These are very insightful, and we really do appreciate them. And we've also had some fine discussions on our Discord. So again, I want to make sure that people are aware of that. So check that out if you're a Patreon subscriber. And if you are on Patreon and you did not get your Discord invite, or you let it expire, just send an email to critreadings@icloud.com, and we will get you your link, and you can join our channel. All right. With that said,
I just want to add the reason the Tolkien-Lewis friendship works is because Lewis was so gregarious and so doggedly determined to maintain the friendship. Right? So the reason I don't think White and Tolkien would work is because they neither one are the kind of person that would have gone out of their way to maintain the friendship. They're both difficult.
Indeed. Well, now some difficult characters. I got a message from Winter this week, Disa, and she said that she detests Morgause, and talk about a difficult character. I think White has gone out of his way to make her as awful as possible. And
She eats cats.
she's really, really dreadful. And it's not just her peculiarities that are dreadful. It's her whole constant persona. Think about how she treats her children, which is especially abominable, right? That studied combination of complete disinterest and then moments of smothering, suffocating affection, as if they're like a hobby that can be taken up and then set aside when one grows tired of it. I think again, this is White's psychoanalytic angle, and he does this with Merlyn. Even Merlyn brings up psychoanalysis in this book. Merlyn's going to suggest that the questing beast, should be psychoanalyzed, and then he tells us that Freud really just basically picked up on what was correct and sort of read it backward and put it into psychoanalytical language. So White really does believe in Freudian psychoanalysis. But I think that Morgause is sort of a backwards reading. Like White has said, let's flesh out the character. What kind of a person would sleep with her brother and raise a son like Mordred? Well, she must be fundamentally broken. Look at Gawain, right, who does, as White point out, eventually kill women. Look at Agravain, who's a traitor. They kill Lamorak when they now in the books. I think it's Gaheris. I think in Mallory it's Gaheris who kills Lamorak, but I believe White spins it around and makes it Agravain who kills Lamorak when he catches Lamorak in bed with his mother. And he gives Agravain this weird Oedipal reading.
Yeah, this is definitely an Oedipal presentation. And the portrayal of Morgause, also the portrayal of women more broadly, is Freudian. Freud rather infamously referred to the female psychology as a dark continent, right? He treats them as some kind of other that can't be sorted out. And
tells you a great deal about Freud, actually.
Yes, that seems to be White's point of view as well. I mean, there are no, female characters that participate in the narrative in anything other than a kind of tokenistic way. They're stand-ins for certain ideas.
Well, wait, because in the next book, we get Guinevere. And she is, we do get her psychology. It is not entirely flattering either, I should point out. We need the Reverend Robert Stephen Hawker to swing in here with his defense of Guinevere after we read White. But in any case, so we get Morgause, and I'll give White this. He spends a lot of time describing her and kind of creating her, and Mallory does not. We don't really, and indeed the Legendarium does not really spend any time on her. She may be tokenistic in White in some regards, but she's pretty much non-existent in the earlier Arthuriana, where she only exists to be the wife of King Lot and thereby to have his sons and also to sleep with Arthur. And what she looks like, what she says, even her speech is just not there, right? It's only what she does in these brief moments. She never really talks even in Mallory, right? She just turns up. We don't know what she says to Arthur or how she gets him to go to bed with her. We don't even know what she looks like. At least in White, he gives us the scene. And then he theorizes about why Arthur might go to bed with her. Well, let's begin then. This is Mau's complaint, right? We've got the Gales right off the beginning. These are the Orkney lads. Now, the Orkneys are a fairly remote bit of what is now Scotland. They're off the north coast, way out in the North Sea, a rather windswept and blasted place with a sort of rough and rugged beauty. But I think that captures the idea why we situate them there. King Lot of Orkney is the father, the patriarch of the family. He's a fancy Arthurian character. He comes down to us from the earliest stories. And he has 4 sons with his wife Morgause, and those sons are Gawain, who is the oldest, or Gawain if you prefer, and then he's got Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth. Now later on there will be a 5th son by Morgause, but that he hasn't been born yet because he'll be fathered by Arthur. So these children are younger than Arthur, but not as White portrays them, much younger. They're just younger than. And I think if we think about the way that Mallory saw the world, when people had to mature a good deal earlier, and your life was compressed into fewer decades, they're probably 7 to 10 years younger, I would think, at the utmost. And so Arthur, we must remember, is also a very, very young man. He's probably, at this point, 18, 20, again, at the utmost. And the boys are 10, around the age of 10. And maybe even younger. Okay. So we get their initial opening. And White spends a lot of time on these catalogs. Lush descriptions, shall we say. So let's have a lush description. This is the beginning of the Queen of Air and Darkness. I actually want the children. I don't want the description of the weathercock. Here it is. The children are sitting on the ground, and they're in the circular tower. The children had erected an amateur tent over their heads, out of the plaids, and under this they were lying close together, telling a story. They could hear their mother stoking the fire in the room below, which made them whisper for fear that she could hear. It was not exactly that they were afraid of being beaten if she came up. They adored her dumbly and uncritically, because her character was stronger than theirs. Nor had they been forbidden to talk after bedtime. It was more as if she had brought them up, perhaps through indifference or through laziness, or even through some kind of possessive cruelty, with an imperfect sense of right and wrong. It was as if they could never know when they were being good or when they were being bad. They were whispering in Gaelic, or rather, they were whispering in a strange mixture of Gaelic and of the old language of chivalry, which had been taught to them because they would need it when they were grown. They had little English. In later years, when they became famous knights at the court of the great king, they were to speak English perfectly, all of them except Gawain, who as the head of the clan was to cling to a Scots accent on purpose, to show that he was not ashamed of his birth. Gawain was telling the story because he was the eldest. They lay together like thin, strange, secret frogs, their bodies well boned and ready to fill out into toughness as soon as they might be given decent nourishment. They were fair-haired. Gawain's was bright red, and Gareth's whiter than hay. They ranged from 10 years old to 14, and Gareth was the youngest of the four. Gaheris was a stolid child. Agravain, the next after Gawain, was the bully of the family. He was shifty, inclined to cry, and frightened of pain. It was because he had a good imagination and used his head more than the others. Some child psychology there from White.
Along with a good dose of English chauvinism.
A little bit, just a dash on top, yes. So I think it's easy, especially because he begins with the Orkney boys, to get on White's case for presenting Gaels, by which he means Scottish and Irish people, incidentally, in a way that isn't particularly flattering. Sort of barbarous, although maybe barbarous isn't the right word, but obsessed with the blood feud and tribal loyalties, and they have their own kind of, what we would say today is their own ways of knowing, right? I think is the term we would use.
I think he treats them as children who need a firm hand, and that hand needs to be English.
Well, I think you're rushing to judgment, because we do get some English knights, and they're idiots. And the Gaels think so too. Eventually the Gaels realize that they're imbeciles, right? In the form of Pellinor and his friends. At first the Gaels think, of course, that it's some sort of mighty plot. It's an English plot. They've been sent there to worm their way into Gaelic society because the knights don't know that there's a war on. And the Gaels do, and they just assume it's all a clever trick. Eventually, once they spend enough time, they realize the knights are idiots. And by extension, this kind of reinforces their view of the English. The English aren't particularly crafty. They're just very, very stupid. And so I think we have to. I mean, White gives as good as he takes, right? Yes, he's mean to the Gaels, but he's also mean to the English. Was it one of our readers? Go ahead.
He's always paternalistic. So in relation to the Gaels, the English are the paternal figure. But within the English themselves, the masses are stupid, and the best of the ruling class, the good ones in the ruling class, are the ones that need to be in charge. So it's always a paternalistic vision. It's just a matter of what's in relation to what.
Do you think that Ector is Ector really paternalistic?
The portions of it I've read, but in every other adaptation of Arthuriana that I've read, Arthur is a defender of the Britons, of the Celtic parts of Brittany, against the Saxon invaders. And here, that's inverted. Arthur hates the Celts.
He's a son of Uther the Conqueror, right?
Well, and this is I'll answer Cooper's and then add on to that. Sir Ector is presented in very paternalistic terms in The Sword in the Stone. It makes a point of saying, yes, his peasants were peasants, but they always had enough food, and feudalism really wasn't so bad if you had a lord like Ector. In other words, the good kind of paternal figure. And this is a kind of appropriation of a Gaelic hero into an English patriotic paradigm, which it's not that White originated that really originates with the Tudors. But you can see how he's just totally flipped things on their heads because he has a Norman Arthur. And Arthur was never a Norman. He wasn't even English. He was Celtic. If there was such a the basis of the myth. I'm not saying there was a historical person, but that's where the myth comes from.
He was Romano-British, right?
Yeah.
And his Normans, even though he's placed it within the 12th century, maybe the 11th century, his Normans are English aristocracy, which 11th and 12th century Normans were certainly not. And they never spoke English, and they didn't give a damn about England so much as their holdings on the continent. That's what mattered to them most.
Absolutely. England was just a sort of a piggy bank. Exactly. They wanted the money from England, but they weren't particularly interested in governing it or anything of that sort. So this is once again a point where White's really fuzzy attitudes towards history in this book, which is a deliberate move, right? He's not confused. He's doing this deliberately. He wants to make it fuzzy so you can't really pin it down. Kind of creates a few problems, right? We have Arthur, who is the son of Uther the Conqueror. And Uther is a stand-in for William, right? Now, William conquers England on the 14th of October, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, right? And then sets about, replacing the majority of the English, the Anglo-Saxon, we should say, aristocracy with Normans, which is necessary because he had promised them land if they defeated the English. That was how he got them on board, because they didn't want to go to England and fight a war that was dangerous and costly, because what they really cared about was Normandy. So the only way you get those people on board is you promise them land. So he had to give them land. He had to displace the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. That's 1066. But we also know that White is setting this a couple centuries later during the High Medieval period. And in fact, the date we get at one point along the way is 1216. Well, that's 150, 60 years, 150 years after the Battle of Hastings, which meant that Uther was either very long-lived indeed or something has gone terribly awry. And at the same time, we're dealing with the Arthur of history. And that Arthur is a Romano-British hero who lives in the 8th century, long before the Normans turned up in England, indeed, even before they turned up in France. They're off. They're Teutons, as White is careful to point out later on. He says, they were Teutons. They were. They're Teutonic peoples who come into France, Gaul at the time. That's why they're called Normans. They're Northmen, men from the north. So they're not genetically French, I guess, Gallic people. They're not Franks. So
Well, those are Celts.
indeed, and they're Celts too, right? So those are Celts as well. So we have this complicated situation. So yes, Drew is quite right to point out that there's an appropriation taking place here. Although I don't know if it starts with White. We might trace
No,
it
it starts with the Tudors. This is a Tudor vision being pushed backwards.
Absolutely. And the Tudors, to be fair, aren't wholly at fault, because they're taking an English tradition descended from Malory that elides the Romano-British foundations of Arthur. Like, you don't find that Arthur's Romano-British in Malory. Malory's not interested in that. He's interested in chivalry and the English political system of his day. And that makes it very easy to take that version of Arthur and put an English spin on him later on, which is indeed what the Tudors do, particularly Henry VIII, who loves Arthurian stories. So all of these complicated things are going on. And White just is happy to continue the appropriation, as it were, and make Arthur really English.
It's also the case that he takes it for granted as a kind of bedrock political fact that should never be questioned, that the English control all of those North Atlantic isles.
Yeah, feudal.
There might be other kingdoms there, so called, but it's really the English who are supposed to be in charge. That's sort of his bedrock vision of Britannia.
Rule Britannia.
If I might push back just a little bit, I don't want to be in the chair where I have to be devil advocate for White's political views. That's an uncomfortable seat. But I will say that he does give Lot's point of view later on, and it's during the Battle of Bedegraine, and he points out that Lot assumes that Arthur will play by the standard conditions of war. And in that discussion, he says, he basically says that Lot really believes that Arthur's claim of overlordship is a fiction. And then in a quasi-narrative moment says, because it is a fiction. So you have to wonder, is this Lot's thinking? He'll abandon the fiction because it is a fiction, or is it White saying, Lot thinks he'll abandon the fiction because it actually is, like in White's view, the narrator's view, it's a fiction. So I think there is a place where maybe but that's it. That brief moment is the pushback, right?
Yeah. And Merlyn says in chapter 3, and I quote, he's talking about the Gaels here. They want to smash up what we may call the United Kingdom into a lot of piffling little kingdoms of their own. The United Kingdom!
It's 1701 already. Look at that. We're flying through history.
And I will say briefly, and not with much gusto in White's defense here, but given the time leading into the Second World War and the Republic of Ireland's neutrality therein, psychoanalytically, I can understand a little bit of his grievance there. And I am usually on the side of the Republic of Ireland in these things, but in this case, maybe he was reacting to that a little bit.
And we know it's on his mind, of course, because we get an anti-Hitler speech from Merlyn, right? Once upon a time, there was this Austrian who thought he could make people embrace a new way of life as well, indeed. Right. So
that's another thing worth pointing out about the difference. There's a tonal difference between The Sword and the Stone and the Queen of Air and Darkness. And it might have something to do with the fact that he's imagining a reader growing up with these books, so they get progressively more dark, more adult. But it's also the case that The Sword and the Stone was written before World War II, and this is written as it's breaking out. And so the whole rest of the series is sort of colored by the fact of the Second World War.
So if we return to the book, what are the Orkney boys talking about? Well, this is, I think, where, at least in my view of Malory, this is, I think, where White cleaves closest to Mallory's true thinking about the foundation of Arthuriana. As I said at the beginning of this podcast, Mallory's concern is about the blood feud that begins, well, even before the events of his book, but really it's traced from Balin and Balin all the way through to the end, right? People slaying each other, and then the blood feud demands revenge, which demands revenge in turn, and on it goes from Balin down through Lamorak and Morgause into her sons, and eventually even to Arthur himself, and the feud between him and Gawain and Lancelot and Mordred and Agravain, all at the end. And there's no way to escape it. Once you start killing, the revenge cycle goes on forever. And it's unimpeachable. Mallory basically says, inside of chivalry, you're allowed to do this. Indeed, you're encouraged to do it. And the consequence of that is destruction. Brings the realm to ruin. Mallory might have had good reasons for thinking this. He was living through the Wars of the Roses, which is effectively a sort of internecine civil blood feud between family members. So, he's sitting in prison writing his Arthuriad. This particular issue is on his mind, so no wonder he wants to trace it rather carefully. White gives us something similar. We didn't have, we spoke about this in our previous podcast on the Sword and the Stone, we don't have Arthur's conception. White now remedies that. He'll remedy it at the beginning of this book, sort of in an evasive way. It's not very clear, but he's going to tell us and leave our minds to fill in the blanks. And at the end of the book, he will do it explicitly. He will say, actually, this is what those boys were talking about all the way back in chapter 1. He even says so in this book, right? So he's going to reference himself at the very end. And what are the boys talking about? They're talking about Uther. Not about Arthur, but about Uther. And what did Uther do? Well, he killed their grandfather, and he married their grandmother, the Lady Igraine. And Lady Igraine had a daughter, and that daughter, she had several daughters, in fact, 3 daughters. And one of those daughters is Morgause, their mother. So there's a blood feud going on with Uther the Conqueror. And remember, Uther is Arthur's father. Now, they don't know who his mother is, but they do know that Arthur is Uther's son. Everybody knows that at this point. So for them, Arthur is a representative of, indeed the direct descendant of, the son of, the man who killed their grandmother, or killed their grandfather, and married their grandmother as a spoil of war. Now remember, Mallory says she liked that. She was happy. Igraine was perfectly happy to be the wife of the new king. That's a very medieval attitude in romances, right? The women are always happy to be the wife of the king. I suppose Emma was happy to be the wife of Canute, right? If we believe the chroniclers. All right. Well, why do we get this potted history? Well, that's why, right? Then we also get Morgause in chapter 1. And the Morgause we get in chapter 1 is a very, this presages how she'll be in the book. Because in chapter 1, she's boiling a cat alive. And this is described in some detail. Not because White is gratuitous, but because he really wants you to hate her, I think, is the goal. And she is detestable, especially if you like me, if you like cats. I like cats a lot. And so reading this is very difficult.
Well, and it's not just that she's doing this to a cat. It's what she's doing it for, kind of just to pass the time trying out a magic spell. And then she gets bored before she can complete the process. So she just throws the whole thing out the window, which means the cat was killed for nothing.
For nothing, yeah. Pointless. And that's it. But that's it. You've got it, Drew. That's the whole persona of Morgause personified in a single episode.
And this is the family's cat. This is a beloved pet. And she thinks nothing of it or the effect that will have on her children but just, there's something about the disposability of ones you love. And that's where I think the horror register lands for me, is that she does not care.
Yeah. She's totally lacking in empathy.
That's it exactly. Yeah. She doesn't care about her children, except, well, if one of them were killed, I'm sure she would pursue vengeance to an insane degree, right? To the nth degree. There would be no restraint.
But not from love.
Not from love. No, exactly. No, it's not about love at all.
It's crazy social obligation, right? Like, you have wounded me, therefore I must wound you in return.
Yeah, there's some sort of narcissism and social, the way that you think about your family and the way the worldview is framed. And I think, and this is a place where Mao will probably agree, I think what White is hinting at, he doesn't say it explicitly here, is that there's something fundamentally Gaelic about this attitude, right?
Oh, well, he
The
says
beastly Irish.
he says quite specifically on several occasions the Gaelic miasma.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about their psychology that's just off. That's just
like
wrong.
women. It's impenetrable wall, right? There's something going on there. Cloud you can't get through. I think that's
deeply chauvinistic.
Yeah, there is something that is absolutely fair. And he mentions that miasma again. The miasma descends, right? And behind the miasma, what's going on? Well, the reason he calls it a miasma is because White is a little Englander, and he is trying to indicate that he finds this unfathomable. He can't understand this tribal attitude, this seeming disconcern with one's own children, with the feelings of others. Morgause is absolutely a narcissist. I don't know that he ever uses the word to describe her.
But he paints it as clearly as he can, because when she's doing this spell with the cat, she says that even though she's not very interested in the spell, in order to do it, she has to stand in front of the mirror to do through trial and error which bits of the cat are going to produce the proper result. And she said it was just an excuse to continue to look at herself in the mirror. So she's quite literally a narcissist, right? She wants to see herself.
Indeed. And she is beautiful. She has black hair and blue eyes. And White points this out several times. And she can make herself very beautiful. At the very end of the book, when she seduces Arthur, White tells us that she knew that she looked her best. So she was trying, and she could be a very attractive individual. So yes, she boils the cat for reasons that are never fulfilled. We don't even know if the magic actually works, because she gets bored putting bits of the cat in her mouth, basically. You have to put it under your tongue, I think. Is that right? I haven't looked at it immediately. But yes, so there's a bone in the cat. A magic bone if you kill it in this way. And if you take the bone out and put it under your tongue, you'll be invisible. And she does this for a while, and then she gets bored and she dumps the boiled cat and all the bones and organs and water out the window. So look out below. So this is how White chooses to open his story. And I think that's interesting because it sets up, it's the combination of the two threads that will run through the story. The one thread is what's going on with Arthur. He was the main character of the previous book, and if you'd read it, you want to know what's happening with Arthur. Well, Arthur, White hasn't explicitly said it, but he has told us how Arthur is connected. He talked about Uther here in book 1. So that's the first thread. And the other thread are the Gales and Morgause. So we've got them here. And that thread is divided in two, right, between the boys and Morgause, but they constantly come into contact with one another. And then there will also be points of contact between the English who turn up in their barge and Morgause. And we'll get more of those in chapter 2. Because Palamedes and Pellinore and Grummore get into a barge. This is a sort of convolution of an episode in the Lancelot Grail, where these three knights get into a barge, and it's a magic barge. It's always magic barges in Arthuriana, and the barge sails away. Well, in White, it sails them to Orkney. This is his invention, and they turn up while Arthur is having that early episode in Mallory with the King of the 100 Knights. And if you were with us in our Mallory episode, this is before Balin and Balin. This is the beginning of Mort Arthur. Arthur has to put down a rebellion, and they fight a series of battles, including an important battle in a forest, and that is called the Battle of Bedegreen in this book. And one of the leaders of that battle is King Lot. Right? There are several other kings as well, and White actually is faithful in listing them. So for us, this is happening early in Arthur's reign if we're looking at Arthuriana. And these three knights, Pellinore, Palamedes, and Grummore, who aren't in Mallory because this isn't covered in Mallory, they're off in Orkney while the men are away fighting a war. And because they were ferried there by barge over some time, they don't know that there's a war. They weren't with Arthur. They don't know there's a rebellion. They have no idea that the Gaels have revolted, basically, against their feudal overlord. And so when they turn up in the town, it's rather peculiar. None of the Gaels tell them that they're at war. And the knights don't know, and the Gaels assume they do, and that they're just being crafty. And this leads to a good deal of mistrust on all sides. I wonder if this is sort of like, if White is thinking of, like, I don't know, German U-boat, soldiers turning up on an English beach. How would they be treated? Bedknobs and broomsticks, right? They'd be run off with magic, maybe? So they will eventually be joined by the questing beast, but at first they are treated hospitably, with an excess of hospitality, in fact. Morgause makes them her project, and this is why she's not paying attention to her children. Now, this is one of those places where, again, I think you're inclined to hate Morgause. She's placing the enemy above her own family, right? These knights show up, and she's going to wine and dine them, and even try to... I get the sense, I don't know that White says it, he kind of implies it strongly, that she's trying to seduce them. Right? Am I alone in this?
No, I got the same impression. In fact, you almost get the sense that she's trying to seduce everyone.
That's a good point.
It's just her basic way of interacting with the world.
Well, that's a good point. Why would White do that?
It's the Freudian psychology through and through.
Yeah. The character that she has to portray in all of this, especially from the Freudian point, is that of the seducer.
Is her way of exercising some kind of power and control? Is it self-gratification then, through the sort of narcissistic exercise of the superego? What's going on exactly?
It's hard to tell because I don't think that White really understands women. I mean, as much as I hate to credit the author for this, I don't think we get a good understanding of the women in Arthuriana until the Mists of Avalon.
Yeah.
And so that's much, much later. And so White, I think, here is, with his usual sort of scattershot, some things land, some things are insightful, and some things are like, wow, you were off target there, buddy.
There doesn't seem to be realistic motivations for Morgause. It's almost as if she's just simply the embodiment of the female id. She's just compulsively driven.
Oh, I don't know. You say there aren't realistic motivations, but I've known people like Morgause.
Well, I'm sure that there are people that behave in ways that she behaves, except that in their cases, I would imagine that we could get down to motivating factors, whereas in her case, it just seems as if this is how she is.
Well, maybe
She's
maybe
a
that's
little
how she.
one-dimensional as a villain.
Maybe she's trying to get some angle on the knights, right? The goal is to, if they really believe, as White seems to imply, the Gales really believe that these knights are there for wicked reasons, right? That they're infiltration or some sort of Trojan horse, or they've got some sort of plot that the Gales don't understand, because the English are so perfidious and so crafty. They're like Cardassians, right? They've got layers and layers of, craft going on. And Morgause's goal is then to figure out what it is. And she determined, as you said, the tool in her box is to get their tool in her box. So the goal now is to seduce them. And maybe White doesn't explicitly say that, but I think that must be part of it, right? And so we see her doing that. And that's understandable, right? As a motivation. She's like a Mata Hari sort of figure then.
Right. The thing is, yes, it does seem as if she's put this within part of her political plot, but we never see from her a genuine interest in the cause of Gaelic independence.
Yes.
I mean, she uses it to do the things that she wants to do, but she doesn't seem as if she cares about that cause.
No, I think that's fair, right? That it's a second order. The supreme order for Morgause is Morgause, yeah, right. Some sort of weird self-gratification thing is going on. And we don't really know why these things gratify her. They just do. Maybe
which is why I'd say she's sort of White's idea of the embodiment of the female id.
Essentially unknowable, right? We don't know why it wants these things. It just does.
Oh, women.
Well, we do get, again, it's a second order concern. So we're going to come back to Arthur and Merlyn and Kay in just a moment. But where the book ends, I want to pursue the Gales to the end, and then we'll come back and we'll pursue the Arthur sequence as well. That way it's better than going back and forth. White goes back and forth to keep you interested in the two stories that are running parallel to each other. But we're going to persist with the Gales. So the end of this sequence in chapter 7 is that in her romantic endeavors, in her attempt to ingratiate herself with her guests, stroke prisoners, Morgause determines that the best way to solve Pellinor's love sickness, because he's lovesick for this gal that he fell in love with off in France, Eleanor, who he will eventually marry, and they'll have children, and we get the children's names even, Aglavale and Percival, and importantly, Lamorak. They need a unicorn. That's how you're going to cure this, with a unicorn. All of Morgause's spells seem to involve cruelty of some sort. Have you noticed that?
Yes.
We have 3 of them in this book. We have the first one, which involves boiling a cat alive. The second one involves capturing and perhaps killing a unicorn. And the third one involves flaying the skin from a person's body. So it can be a dead person in this case. So it's not entirely cruel, but it is gross. So they need a unicorn. And they go off hunting for a unicorn and they don't find one. And because the children, her 4 boys, are so ignored, sort of the alternating between total disinterest and smothering, brief moments of smothering affection, performative interest, we could say, right? Actual disinterest and moments of performative interest. They are desperate, as White tells us, for her affection. Indeed, they sort of hang on it. They worship their mother. Agravain more than worships her. There's something deeply wrong with Agravain, right? He really does want to sleep with his mother, although he can't, he doesn't know that, but it's one of those sort of unconscious things.
It's the Oedipal complex.
It's the Oedipal complex, yeah. And it makes him extremely violent as well, which we learn, because, he wants to actually injure and a harm and cause pain. Whereas we notice with Gaheris and Gareth, that's not necessarily the case, and he kind of gets upset with them that they're too reluctant to cause injury. Anyway, they decide to go off with this unicorn, and they get a girl, and they abuse her mightily. They pull her by her hair. They suggest tying her braids together, and then they do it with a stick. So they can basically drag her around. And then they pass her between them so that they can gesticulate while they talk and have their hands free. No one has to hold the servant girl that they're dragging by her hair. And she's piteously whining and crying because they need a virgin. There's a meaningful scene, actually, when they come up with this plan. Why don't we look at it? Let's see. This is in chapter 6, after Tortelbach. Saint Turtleback. Tortelbach.
And make a big deal out of emphasizing that Morgause is going to be the virgin for their unicorn hunt.
That's exactly what I'm looking for, is that moment, right?
It's in 7.
It's in 7.
Or at least in my edition, it's in 7.
Is it? I'm at the point where they've got the girl. It's further back than that, isn't it? Ah, yes, it's the very beginning of 7. Yeah, they must have a virgin to attract it. On top of this, there was a trouble which distressed the children in particular. Queen Morgause had set her cap at the visitors. This is why I think she's trying to seduce them. That was the line. "What was our mother doing?" asked Gawain, as they made their way toward St. Tortelbach's cell one morning, "with the knights on the mountain." Gaheris answered with some difficulty after a long pause. "They were out hunting a unicorn." "How do you do that?" "There must be a virgin to attract it." "Our mother," said Agravain, who also knew the details, "went on a unicorn hunt, and she was the virgin for them." His voice sounded strange as he made this announcement. Gareth protested. "I did not know she was wanting a unicorn. She has never said so." Agravain looked at him sideways, cleared his throat, and quoted, "Half a word is sufficient to the wise man." Well, this is interesting, right? At least to me. You really get a sense that there's something wrong with Agravain here, and you get more and more of it as this episode continues, and then later on it will become especially difficult. Agravain, of course, in this version of the text, he'll kill Morgause one day. He'll catch her in bed with Lamorak. And
you get a very Norman Bates reading from
that is
Agravain
right,
here.
and this is of course before Psycho, but that is another Freudian. That's a very Freudian film,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So there's
I guess we
something.
should say Pictish Bates, not Norman Bates.
So yes, we have this Agravain, and White is careful to point out his voice sounds strange. He's speaking very carefully. They're all speaking very carefully, right? And there's a sort of difference between Gareth, who's completely innocent. You know, this is going to be Gareth who's Beaumains later on, right? Gareth Whitehands. And he's, "Oh, I didn't know she wanted a unicorn. She never said so." Completely innocent. He's the youngest, right? According to White, he's 10. So he doesn't know what's going on. The oldest, Gawain, is 14. So by that point, they know that their mother is not a virgin. Indeed, how could she be? She has 4 sons. But this is completely lost on Gareth, who's like, "Oh, of course, they needed a virgin. Why wouldn't they take our mother?" Right?
He loves his mother. Yeah, he can't
loves
think
her
of
in
her
an
as
uncomplicated way, right?
yeah.
He doesn't love her in the Agravain, weird Norman Bates way. I think that's absolutely right.
Well, and for Agravain, she can be a virgin because that's how he prefers to see her,
Yeah.
untouched by anyone else.
And that's why this conversation is so uncomfortable, because reality is impinging on the fantasy, right? And it takes a lot of mental gymnastics, cognitive dissonance to keep it out. You don't want to be reminded, in fact, of your own existence, because your own existence is a refutation. So Agravain has a a good deal of subsumed resentment and anger about the nature of reality, and that comes out, I think, in his violence. We can't read this whole episode, unfortunately, but we will say briefly it's extremely violent.
The killing of the unicorn is really quite nasty.
It is, and it's meant to be, right? Because the unicorn itself is presented as completely innocent, and totally sympathetic.
It laid its head in their mother's lap.
Yeah. It has a noble bearing, right? And even the girl makes a regal gesture towards it. Her interactions with it are perforce. She doesn't want to be involved in this. And the other boys simply want to catch it because they think, well, we'll take it to our mother alive. But that isn't what Agravain is willing to do. He spears it with the boar spear over and over and over and over again. And I think it's important that it's a spear, right?
Yeah, it has the feeling of a rape scene.
Yeah, it has to be penetrated. Why? Because it's a rival for his mother's affections. It's something she actually wants. And she doesn't want them, and him in particular, right? She's disinterested. So here's this rival.
Well, in his mind, if he provides her this, then he becomes the object of desire.
Yeah. Kill it and give it to her, right?
And it's important that it's a unicorn, right? It is another male figure.
Absolutely, with its one horn, right? Absolutely. So this is probably could I go so far as to say it's the most Freudian part of the entire book? I think it might be, right?
No, I'd agree with that.
Right? There's a lot
Just
of
wants
it.
to make sure you don't miss it. Don't miss the Freudian.
We'll get it. We get a lecture on it in the final book, in The Candle of the Wind. We get a long, multi-paragraph lecture on Desdemona and Cleopatra and mother figures who smother their children, and that the mother's love is more fatal than the sword, right? So what if Mark Antony fell on his sword? It only killed him, is what White says. But, it's Cleopatra's motherly love that was the real poison. So later on, we will get that. But I think in terms of not just as a didactic lecture, but in encoding it into the narrative, this chapter in this book is the summit. This is where White goes full on Freudian. The unicorn, the girl that they drag along and force to participate. There's a sort of non-sexual rape taking place with her. The motherly motivation, the different attitudes of the boys towards their mother's sexuality, the violence they do to the unicorn, and then what's done afterwards and how they respond to that. With the Gralloch, right? They decide they're going to basically, my father would say, clean. They're going to gut it so that they can take it home as a proper trophy. And they don't know what they're doing. They've only just got a general sense of how to do this. Incidentally, that wouldn't be the case. If they were 10 to 14 years old, they would know how to do this. But they don't in this book, and they make a mess of it, and they perforate the bowels and the intestines, and there's shit everywhere, and it's awful and terrible. And it's especially important, as Drew says, that this is done to a unicorn, which is spotless and complete innocence. And it's completely desecrated in every way. I think this is hyper Freudian, right? It goes to 11 in a way no other chapter in the entire tetralogy does. It's the chapter you use as an example if you want to prove that White was a Freudian. You say, well, there's this chapter. And that'll do it. The rest of the book notwithstanding. Okay. What about Arthur? And Kay, actually.
Just as an aside, I would say that White is very good at taking an abstract conceptual framework and devising a narrative that portrays it. Because he does this over and over again.
All the animals.
But he never... Right, all the animal scenes are like that. But he never seems to trust his readers to get it. So
Yeah.
he also has to put in the didactic bits where he spells it out conceptually. Like, no, you've already made your point. We get it.
Is it important because of the age of his readership? Is it important because of the historical moment he's living in? Or is White just ham-handed?
To me, it
In
feels
this
very
book,
similar to,
I'm going with ham.
yeah. I think it's similar to Bernard Shaw, who is also deeply
Yes.
concerned about people misreading his texts. So he tells you exactly how to read it.
I think that's fair. Yeah. And
What
I
is
think that the comparison with Bernard Shaw is it shows you that it doesn't have to preclude you being a great author, but it is a flaw. All right. Well, what about Arthur and Merlyn and Kay? If you were reading book 1 and you picked up this book, which begins with the Orkney boys, you might be saying, "Where's Arthur? I want to know more about Arthur." Well, chapter 3 brings us to them. And it also begins with Morgause, which I think is a signal moment. It'll end with Morgause. The Arthur stuff ends with Morgause and begins with Morgause. Here's what is written in chapter 3 at the very beginning. I love this. We've just had this narcissistic woman boiling a cat, and her devoted children, starved of love, desperate for her approbation. And then we switch to Kay and Arthur, and this is what we get at the beginning of chapter 3. Sir Kay had heard stories about the Queen of Orkney, and he was inquisitive about her. "Who is Queen Morgause?" he asked one day. "I was told that she is beautiful. What did these old ones want to fight us about? And what is her husband like, King Lot? What is his proper name? I heard somebody calling him the King of the Out Isles, and then there are others who call him the King of Lothian and Orkney. Where is Lothian? Is it near High Bazil? I can't understand what the revolt was about. Everybody knows that the King of England is their feudal overlord. I heard that she has 4 sons. Is it true that she doesn't get on with her husband?" I quite like
As you
this.
know, Bob.
He's got a million questions, doesn't he? All about her and her husband. And where is Orkney? And where is Lothian? And is he the King of Lot and King of Orkney? Or is he the King of Lothian? Well, of course, this is White playing having a little bit of fun, because the different versions of Arthuriana make Lot the leader of different places. But we also, I think, get the idea that there is something fascinating about Morgause. And White is quite right about this. I mean, as Lane was right to point out, in the Mists of Avalon, Marion Zimmer Bradley's books, right? Morgause and Guinevere and the female characters get a lot of interest and a lot of fleshing out because they're interesting. We want to know more about them.
And they become real characters rather than just, cardboard cutouts.
Indeed. And
Plot devices.
for all White's flaws, he's an important part of that tradition. He is involved in fleshing out Morgause and Guinevere to a greater degree than anyone else has done. Now, the portrayal of Morgause is awful, right? She's really horrid. But, stories need villains, and he's given us a very memorable one. It's hard to think of anyone in this book other than Mordred who is as compelling a villain as Morgause is. And she hardly ever speaks. I think she only says one line in the entire book. And that's a very dismissive, offhanded line to her children. Something like, "Love, that's fine, my precious," or that's wonderful. Because she's not listening is the sense you get, right? I'm not paying attention to you. It's just a thing I say. And I think that's her only line of speech. It's her only line of dialogue. The offhanded thing you say to your children when you're not really listening and you want to give them the impression that you are. Which I have had to use on occasion. So I understand it. But that's all she has for them, right? That and then just the smothering performative affection.
It's either the one or the other, right? It's either total indifference or she's devouring them.
Yeah, and then again, the devouring isn't real. It's just, it's a way of convincing herself that she cares about them. right? I think I have that right. Anyway, this is where we get to see, and this is for Philip, who mentioned, wouldn't it be great if we had more of White's social and political views? Now you get it. A long debate between Arthur and Kay and Merlyn, all of whom hold similar but different political attitudes. And the question is the question of might and right. And Arthur will eventually come up with a way, and we'll talk about this in next week's episode when he starts talking about chivalry as his solution. But he raises a problem here with Merlyn, and the problem is, how do we deal with might and right? And Merlyn basically gives him a course in just war theory. And the idea is that someone at some point, and I'm condensing it and I'm eliding some complexity here, but someone at some point throws the first punch. That person has transgressed, and they are the party who is at fault. Even if some other force is being brought to bear on them that isn't violent, including, and Arthur and Kay bring this up explicitly, including non-violent but economic means of pressure. Now, if you're
like starvation, for example,
or like an oil embargo, right, in the Second World War. So the United States is embargoing Japanese oil and starving their country of oil. This is one of the reasons why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It doesn't justify the attack, but this is the thing that Arthur and Kay are thinking about, because of course White is thinking about it too, because it's happening when he's writing these books, right? He is writing this book in the Second World War. So he's perfectly aware of all the political stuff that's going on. And White is basically defending, in this moment, he's defending the Americans. He's saying, well, no, the Americans may have put pressure on Japan through economic means, but that doesn't give Japan the right to respond violently. They should have talked it out. Now, Arthur and Kay are skeptical, to say the least. What do we think, Drew? Is Merlyn's defense, is his just war theory such as it is, which is, again, it's informal, it's through dialogue, so it's not going to be rigorous, but is it compelling?
No, it's not compelling. I mean, it's such a narrow understanding of violence that only if you can accept this narrow definition of violence does the whole thing work. So exerting pressure on another population to the extent that you're starving them is violence. But it doesn't meet the definition that Merlyn posits here, which is throwing the first punch, right? So you have to have launched a missile. You have to have fired a shot. You have to have drawn your sword. So any other kind of violence doesn't count. You can exploit all day long, and no one ever has the right to fight back. But as soon as you fire a bullet or draw your sword, well, then it's okay to defend yourself. So you basically have to submit to any kind of exploitation whatsoever to avoid being the one that starts the violence.
I hope that I've not.
It doesn't really work as a concept within self-defense. In the law, we have this response to self-defense called provoking the difficulty, where you cannot claim that you're acting in self-defense if you're the one who started the whole thing. By one of the ways that it's written in some of the states in which I practice, based on our old 19th century law, is going armed and seeking quarrel with someone. So if I grab a weapon and I go and I intend to talk to someone while I'm wearing a weapon on my side, I have to understand that that is provoking. That is a violent act in and of itself, even if I haven't drawn my weapon, even if I haven't thrown the first punch. The fact that I had that implied threat there prevents me from claiming honest self-defense.
Well, and that it's interesting to bring up murder. I think that's a helpful thing because Merlyn brings that up too, and I think he's confused about it. As he says, a murderer, for instance, is not allowed to plead that his victim was rich and oppressing him. So why should a nation be allowed? Wrongs have to be redressed by reason, not by force. But there are circumstances in law where murder can be reduced to a lower kind of crime, where murder can be justified because of the context. But he seems to imagine there is no context in which killing could be justifiable.
Which is, again, a very, very strange position to be in, given England's position in the Second World War.
Right.
If they had just kept on appeasing Hitler, this White would have ended up speaking German.
Well, and it results in a kind of permanent acquiescence to status quo. This is made quite explicit by Merlyn in chapter 3, when he says, this is a paragraph. Uther, he said at length, your lamented father was an aggressor. So were his predecessors, the Saxons, who drove the old ones away. But if we go on living backward like that, we shall never come to the end of it. The old ones themselves were aggressors against the earlier race of the copper hatchets, and even the hatchet fellows were aggressors against some earlier crew of Exwamo who lived on shells. You simply go on and on until you get to Cain and Abel. But the point is that the Saxon conquest did succeed, and so did the Norman conquest of the Saxons. Your father settled the unfortunate Saxons long ago, however brutally he did it, and when a great many years have passed, one ought to be ready to accept the status quo. Also, I would like to point out that the Norman conquest was a process of welding small units into bigger ones, while the present revolt of the Gaelic Confederation is a process of disintegration. They want to smash up what we may call the United Kingdom into a lot of piffling little kingdoms of their own. That is why their reason is not what you might call a good one. So the status quo has to be right. Whatever is right, as Pope puts it. He seems to not countenance the idea that if the status quo is based on having plundered a population and accumulated vast sums of wealth, that one possibility might be to perhaps distribute that wealth more fairly, rather than continuing in a situation where the plunderer gets to continue to enjoy the fruits of plunder.
You have to wonder if, again, going back to the register of the Second World War, how many years did the unified Austria and Germany and Sudetenland exist? After how many years was all of that okay? And you just have to say, well, yes, Hitler was brutal in his unification of Europe, but it was decades ago, and so now we just have to live with this new status quo of racial purges and militarism.
How long is long enough for the status quo to be status?
Well, Merlyn would probably yell at you for trying to pin him down, right?
But the devil's in the details. That's
the thing. So Merlyn doesn't want to get bogged down in details. He's only conveying general instruction here, and I think maybe part of this, if we're being generous to White, is because Merlyn is trying to get Arthur, because Arthur is the king. He's trying to get Arthur to behave like a king. It's the king's job to sort out the details. So Merlyn is just giving him very general rules and saying you have to come up with the details yourself. So here's an example. And this is in chapter 4. This is when they have they really get into the just war theory. But supposing, said Kay, that one side was the one to make the threat, while the other side was the one to strike the first blow. Oh, go and put your head in a bucket. I'm not suggesting that all of them can be decided. I was saying from the start of the argument that there are many wars in which the aggression is as plain as a pikestaff, and that in those wars, at any rate, it might be the duty of decent men to fight the criminal. If you aren't sure that he is a criminal, and you must sum it up for yourself with every ounce of fairness you can muster, then go and be a pacifist by all means. I recollect that I was a fervent pacifist myself once, in the Boer War, when my own country was the aggressor, and a young woman blew a squeaker at me on Mafeking night. So, it's worth noting that Merlyn is not a pacifist anymore, or because he lives backwards, right? He will be a pacifist eventually, but he's not a pacifist at this particular moment. He says that there are people who are criminals, and you have to judge them on the details for yourself, as fairly as you can, he says. So these are not completely general principles that are universally applicable. But he says, in most cases, or at least in many cases, it is clear who the aggressor is. And you can point them out and say, that person is responsible. They're the person who has to be opposed. So I don't know that he's giving us a universal key to resolve all discussions of guilt in war. But maybe he is right that in many conflicts you can say, well, actually, it's clear one side is the aggressor. Would you be willing to stretch that far, Drew?
I would say the paradigm is off from the beginning, because he's thinking about war in terms of individual actors.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the right way to analyze it. There's no analysis here of material forces, of systemic forces, of any of these other kinds of agencies that lead to violence, that are causes of violence. He just seems to imagine there are some bad apples who are aggressive, and they occasionally start punching, and then good people have to come along and stop them.
But the reasons, protested Arthur, if one side was starving the other by some means or other, some peaceful economic means which were not actually warlike, then the starving side might have to fight its way out, if you see what I mean.
Starving another population is not a peaceful economic means.
I see what you think you mean, said the magician, but you are wrong. There is no excuse for war, none whatsoever.
There's no peaceful way to starve another population. There's not a peaceful action.
No, I think that's quite right. I think that's a fair point, right? And this is where Arthur kind of subordinates himself to Merlyn's response, and he should say, well, wait a minute. That's, maybe the fault is in the premise, because Arthur says, it's some peaceful means. What he should say is, some sort of legal means, right? It's ostensibly legal. I'm not doing anything illegal by blockading the population and preventing food getting in, but it isn't peaceful, right, to starve people.
But isn't that part of the Nazi grievance of the interwar period? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that the Allies were so cruel to Germany and not allowing us to rebuild our economy after? Well, again, we did try to take over the world. No one disputes that. But now you won't let us feed our people.
We need breathing room, right?
It is absolutely the case that the Allies caused the Second World War by purporting, by maintaining a fiction that the Germans were uniquely responsible for the First World War, and therefore all of the consequences need to be put on them.
Yep.
That led to the Second World War. The Allies did that.
Yeah, and I think that's generally accepted, right? Now, the proximate cause, of course, is Hitler and the invasion of Poland and the rape of Czechoslovakia and things of that sort, but there are certainly there are systemic things going on that allow Hitler to rise to power and make these conditions, persuasive to the German people, who, remember, elected him, right? So I think we have to view this discussion between Merlyn and Arthur and Kay with a little bit of salt, because Merlyn's attitude, as Drew says, is a very narrow view of what constitutes violence. And maybe if Arthur were a little bit older and more experienced, he would push back and say, wait a minute, though. It's not actually peaceful to starve a population.
And White can't go there, because to go there would be to acknowledge what his own empire had done and was doing, so that they're no longer just the unequivocal good guys who police morality around the world. I mean, they are aggressors.
He's willing to,
and inter-imperial aggression is what caused the First World War and led to the Second World War.
But he is willing to call out, the British Empire for moments of aggression. That's why he calls the British Empire in the Boer War. He says that they're the aggressor, right?
He's willing to criticize it around the edges. But as far as the imperial, the moral vision of a British Empire. He doesn't want to let go of that as a whole. He just wants to, there's some bad actors and there's some bad decisions, and we could do better of it.
Well, I'm tempted
Seems
to
strange
defend
you
the
can
Boer
criticize the Boer War, but not India or Ireland.
War. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'll defend all three. The Boer War too. Up the empire.
Well, we know that you're the Churchillian here.
It's very important that we keep China British. All right. Well, that's where we're going to stop for this week. But next week, we'll read the conclusion, the remaining 7 chapters. And we'll get to see Arthur flesh out his alternative. Because now we've had several, in this book, we have several episodes where he and Kay talk to Merlyn, and also he talks to Merlyn about the problems of might versus right. And actually, White doesn't use the language here, but he will do it later on, that there's a sort of sportsman's etiquette that is around things. We see this at the very end of this book, and later on, it's that metaphor is made explicit. They talk about being taught. They use the language of cricket, being top of the averages, and so on and so forth. And that's the real problem, is that Arthur at the beginning of this book is perfectly happy to fit into that paradigm. Isn't it cool to be a king? You get to go out and kill all sorts of kerns, serfs, and they can't even touch you because you're wearing armor. Isn't that brilliant? I killed 150 of them. And Merlyn is saying this is actually not a good way to run a country. We need an alternative. And he imparts this to Arthur and says, think about this really. What would it feel like to be the kern? Is anything actually being accomplished by this? And so Arthur has to go away and think about it. Merlyn won't tell him. Just says, go away and come up with something better. That's in the next episode. So stay tuned. You won't want to miss it. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you may want to support it to help keep all of our episodes online and ad-free for all of our listeners. You can do that by going to criticalreadings.com and clicking Become a Patron at the top of the page. And we will put your name in the credits for as long as you're a supporter. And we'll send you a link to our Discord channel where you can watch or listen to the podcast live, participate in discussions and forums with our other subscribers, and even vote on our Reader's Choice episodes several times a year. Thank you to all of you who are supporters. And thank you also this week to Lane Haygood, Esquire. And Dr.
Pleasure.
Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
That's it for us this week, but we'll be back next week with the second half of The Queen of Air and Darkness. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.